Shalom. I want to start off by giving all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashum, Yahweh Shai, Bahashum, Racha Kodash. I want to give double honors to our apostles and elders of Great Millstone, who rule well, and grace and peace to you elect around the four winds, believing in His truth and all sincerity. May the blessing of election be upon your houses. This is your fellow servant, Clay from the GMS Orlando camp, coming at you with another impromptu lesson. And as you can tell from the title of this lesson, we're living in some very historic times. Literally history is in the making as we speak, by the way that the Lord is performing in the earth, his judgments and his word. It's literally history being made right now. You know, the inspiration for this lesson comes from a conversation I had yesterday with the Uber driver. I was supposed to catch a flight out yesterday from Orlando, and the flight ended up getting canceled amidst the abrupt end of Spirit Airlines, which put out 17,000, which put 17,000 people out of a job. So now 17,000 people are freshly unemployed, added into the unemployment line, which is going to put in a heavier strain on the economy. Which Lord willing, we'll do a video on later later on today as well. All right, but amidst all that chaos that was taking place in the airport yesterday, uh, my flight got canceled, and I ended up having to go back to the house, catching the Uber back to the house. And when I hopped in the Uber, said to me was, yeah, man, there's crazy things going on right now. Crazy things going on right now. And it's another, you're really starting to notice how the Lord, people are starting to notice, however, the handiwork of Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai in the earth through his judgments. People are starting to notice more often now. It's not a thing of the past, or it's not a thing of, gray areas anymore. People are actually starting to see the judgments of Yahweh Bashim Yahweh Shai, and starting to recognize that there's something going on in the earth that is unusual, that's unprecedented. And this guy he was one of them. He might listen to the prophets, because some of the things that he was saying were exactly the points, or were some of the points that brothers make in some of the lessons. But nevertheless, one of the first things he said to me was, "There's some very crazy things going on today, man. Like some very crazy times that we're living in." And I agreed. I agreed. I said, "You're right. This is history in the making. We're living in some very historic times." And he said, You're right. You're right. You're very right. The Spirit Airlines thing, man. This really is going to put a strain on the economy. I don't know where this is going to be. I don't know where we're going to be in the next few years, but I'm along for the ride." you know, he said, "I don't know where I'm going to be in the next few years, but I'm along for the ride." And that's really the majority of these Babylonians. They have no clue as to where this is headed, as to where the Lord is taking this kingdom, this empire, which is to complete destruction. They have no idea where it's headed, but they're along for the ride. They're along for the ride, wherever Babylon takes them. But another thing that he said was, later on in the conversation, as he got more comfortable, he said, "I don't believe that America can beat Iran." And it kind of struck me as, at first, I'm not gonna lie, at first I was like, what the fuck? Like, where did this come from? Because he was speaking about his sister graduating from medical school, him going to Miami, and he was going to party in Miami, and he was graduating from aerospace mechanic school in May or something like that. And then all of a sudden he said, "Man, I don't know where we're going to be, but I'm along for the ride." And honestly, man, I don't think that America can beat Iran. And I said, "Man, why don't you think so?" He said, "Just look at the military. Those guys are willing to fight and die." I said, I said, "You're right, man. They actually have, you know, uh, a belief system, that they're willing to die for, unlike these Americans." He was like, "Yes, you're right. You take the contrast between the Iranian military and the American military. There's a stark contrast. They're more used to war. They're more used to hard times." And I was like, "You're exactly right, man." And when you get into the American military, a lot of these people join the American military because of the benefits, because of the housing benefits and the VA benefits, how much money they make a month without having to work. You know, a lot of these people get into the American military because of what they have to gain. They have no interest in backing the country that they fight for. They have no interest in fighting for Babylon. Whereas the Iranian military, they're fighting for their country. They're fighting to keep their people alive, to keep their country essentially free from Western rule. So they have a lot riding on this fight. They have a lot more riding on this fight than these Babylonians, which is putting a bigger battery in their back. And like uh that show uh Game of Thrones, one of the things that Jakara said, I believe that's what her name was. She said, "Worst thing that you can give a military is experience. The best thing that you can give a military is experience." And those Iranians have been getting years of experience, starting from around 2011, 2012 when when Babylon first started bombing them. From that point on to now, they have experience especially concerning Western military tactics. How Babylon the Great likes to move. How they like to attack. Their points of attack. They have experience concerning Western warfare and concerning war in itself. And now we're living in a time to where Iran and these different other nations aren't weak anymore. As the prophecy says, the weak are now saying, "I'm strong," because they have the backing of Russia and China. Now they're being supplied with uh, weaponry that they would otherwise have never been able to catch up with, never been able to acquire on their own means. But now they have weaponry that has put them in the fight, has given them a fighting chance. And now all these nations are starting to gear up for war. They're starting to pour in to their defense systems, pour into their weaponry, because they understand that war is imminent. War is imminent, is inevitable. It's going to happen. It's only a matter of time. And just as sure as they realize that, now these Americans are starting to realize it as well. And they're starting to realize that the war with Iran, China, Russia, and these different countries is inevitable. Because another thing that he mentioned to me was how America was isolating itself from the world stage. Now he didn't say the world stage, but he said America's really separating from all its allies. And it really doesn't make any sense. Why would you draw your friends into a war that they don't want to be in? Which is why I believe he listens to the prophets, because I've heard that I heard that point made by many different brothers in their lessons. I don't think that's something that he would just come up with on his own. But he said, "Yeah, I don't think that I don't. Why would you draw your allies into a war, into a fight that they don't want to fight, and then discard them?" And I'm listen. I'm agreeing. Because America has isolated themselves along with Israel on the world stage, and we understand according to prophecy that the least of the flock would draw America out, would draw Babylon out, and that's exactly what they're doing. They're drawing them out into a battle that they can't win. A battle that is ultimately going to mean the end of this kingdom. Draw the end of this reign of terror for Esau Edom. You know, and he was speaking about how um America, needs a dictator. That was one of his solutions. You know, alongside stopping voting, and really putting a dictator in place to govern the people properly. And he mentioned Gaddafi. Somebody like Gaddafi, should be governing over America, which ultimately that's not going to work either. Ultimately, the one that is supposed to govern and is going to govern the earth itself properly is Yahweh Shai. The scriptures say in Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, the 10th chapter, in the 4th verse, that in due time the Lord is going to set over the earth one that is profitable. All right, and that one that is profitable is speaking about Yahweh Shai, because Yahweh Shai is going to judge with justice and equity. All right, something that this world lacks, something that this world hasn't seen since the reign of King Solomon. So the one that is profitable is being raised up, and stirred up as we speak. And he's starting to visit the world more and more, all right, through prophecy, through the different happenings that are taking place in the earth. And right now, history is in the making. You know, everything that we're witnessing right now, everything that we're experiencing is going to be told for generations on in. How the Lord destroyed Babylon and destroyed Esau Edom, one of our chiefest enemies. And the way that he did it is going to be spoken about for generations. The way that the Lord strategically dismantled Babylon the Great is going to be a thing of ages. It's going to be a story of ages. Just like they tell the story of Cristobal Colon, or these different devils, Andrew Jackson, his conquest on the so-called Native Americans, you know, George Washington, all these different guys, these forefathers, so to speak. Just like how these Edomites love to tell stories of their these wicked ass niggas that they call their forefathers. All right, stories of Yahweh Shai are going to be even more magnified on how Yahweh Shai completely subjugated the world in 1 hour at that too. In 1 hour, the Lord subjugated the chiefest empire on the earth, subjugated the Edomites under his foot, and took control of the earth. That's going to be a story for ages. And it's going to be a story that's magnified far above, the wicked conquest of, these Edomites, man. Because the world is going to benefit, as a result of Yahushua's conquest. The world is going to, relish in the fact that Yahushua came and dominated Esau Edom. But with that being said, man, I'm approaching my destination. Lord, when it's satisfied unto you elect. I want to give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashum Yahushai, Bahashum Rokach Kodash. Double honors to our apostles and the elders of Great Millstone who rule well. Grace and peace to you elect around the four winds, believing and pushing this truth in all sincerity. May the blessing of election be upon your houses. Shalom. Stay up.